Hey everyone, welcome to Post Blast. My name's Jimmy. Not that Jimmy, a much more chill Jimmy, one who really likes explosives and blowing things up for a living. I'm a former Army Explosive Ordnance Disposal Technician, or as we call it, EOD. Today, I want to talk about some pagers and radios that exploded. Enjoy. On September 17th, 2024, thousands of pagers across Lebanon began to spontaneously explode. On the following day, there was another wave of explosions, this time targeting handheld radios. Now this wasn't some Samsung Galaxy Note 7 detonation event, so we can rule out batteries as being the culprit. This was a demonstration of how a massively effective intelligence enterprise, a severely gray understanding of what the law of war is, and some diabolical engineering can come together and create an unholy Black Mirror fanfic event. You see, the part that gets my goat is just how indiscriminate this attack was. People just be out there bebopping around town and then BAM! Look, Ma, no hands. Now let me paint you a picture, as it were. Imagine you're just walking around Walmart and you're trying to find an employee to unlock that case so you can get some deodorant. By the way, when did people start locking deodorant behind cases? This is ridiculous. Now, back to it. You pressed the button. You waited. You pressed it again. You fulfilled your societal obligation and followed the rules, and yet nobody comes. Pacing up and down the main drag as you look for the blue vest that can save you from your situation. At last, you spot the critically endangered Walmart employee helping a customer next to the paper towels. You breathe a sigh of relief, and you mosey on over to the pair and stand to the side and wait your turn. As you wait, out of nowhere and with no warning whatsoever, the other customer finds out how it feels to chew 5 gum real quick and hits the ground. Across the store, another explosion. Then 2 more in the parking lot, until the sounds of screams and overloaded mobility scooters drowns out the explosive carnage. No, I'm not projecting. Apparently my Walmart has a lot of Hezbollah members. Now you may be wondering why these devices were targeted. And heck, you might even just be curious as to why Hezbollah was using them in the first place. I'll go over why they were using them later in the video, but first, I want to tell you about these seemingly ancient technologies. Since I'm a millennial, I vividly remember a world where pagers were the norm, and wearing your communication devices on your hip wasn't the fashion crime it is today. For those who don't know how pagers work, here's a little background. Pagers haven't really been in use by the public since the early 90s. They were made mostly obsolete since cell phones became more affordable and just offered a faster and better way to communicate. Just imagine getting a text message, not being able to text back on the thing, and then having to hunt down a phone to respond to the message. Have you even seen a payphone, let alone use one? This alone is reason enough for pagers to have gone the way of the dodo. These days, pagers are mainly used for people who work in medical and emergency services. You see on TV how a doctor checks her pager and rushes off to perform life-saving procedures on a blind orphan nun, and there's pretty good reason why they were using the pager rather than the cell phone. Pagers don't use regular cell phone networks because they can become congested or otherwise fail during a natural disaster. Most pagers receive radio signals in the 150 to 174 megahertz range, since the lower frequency can penetrate deep into sturdy buildings like hospitals. Simply put, pagers receive their signals from older paging systems that work like traditional radio towers. Some systems send signals through a combination of towers and satellites that ride along internet protocols. Each device is assigned its own identification code that precedes the actual message, so only the intended pager receives and displays the information. Now, the amount of data that is sent to a pager is very small. It's usually a simple text message or phone number to tell the recipient who to call in order to get the full message. It is believed that the primary pager used in the attack was the Gold Apollo brand AR-294 model. It was a rugged-style model that could receive and display up to 4 lines of data on its backlit LCD screen. Unlike many other models of pagers used in the area, the AR-294 had a lithium-ion battery that could be recharged with a USB cable that could last up to 85 days on a full charge. Gold Apollo has stripped just about every mention of this pager from the internet, and the only solid information I could gather is from a December 2023 archive of the original website. All the manufacturer said about the battery itself was that it was lithium-ion. It did say in the maintenance section that the spring contacts could be replaced, which leads me to believe that the battery was removable. The reason I harp on whether or not the battery was removable is to tackle the rumors that the batteries themselves were where the explosives were planted, but more on that later. Now to talk about the radios that were used in the attack, they were based on the Japanese-manufactured ICOM IC-V82 handheld transceivers. These handheld radios have the ability to send and receive analog voice and data. There are modules that can be attached that would allow for digital encryption, but it doesn't look like any of this was installed. It is highly likely that the radios were Chinese knockoffs produced after ICOM discontinued this model in 2014. Either way, it still had the same basic function and compatibility with one another, so it doesn't really matter. These are the same radios I saw in Afghanistan, where the Taliban used them to report on our position and coordinate attacks against us. Since these radios don't really need a tower or provider to operate on their own, they're very appealing to anyone wanting to communicate without relying on a vulnerable network infrastructure like cell phone towers or satellites. Worst case scenario, if you don't have a repeater, you can set up a series of users to relay the message. Basically, these things are cheap, convenient, and you can clone the settings from one radio to another with just a standard audio cable. Perfect for anyone who wanted to remain off the regular communication grid and still be able to speak effectively. Now that we know the background of the devices used in the attack, let's talk about why Hezbollah wanted to use them in the first place. After reports within Hezbollah's intelligence arm indicated that smartphones were no longer a secure method of communication, they opted to order their members to use low-tech devices instead. This was an attempt to eliminate the threat of remote tracking and spying that target common smart devices. Switching things up like this is actually a valid tactic, since going low-tech when the enemy is high-tech, it forces them to adjust their targeting methods. This should have theoretically worked for a time were it not for the foresight of Israeli intelligence. Turns out, Israel already had a contingency for something like this and already had pagers and radios purchased, modified, and a shell company stood up to cover the sale to Hezbollah. Once it was determined that the devices would one day find their way into the hands and pockets of Hezbollah, Israel was quick to get to work. They did so by disassembling the pagers and radios and implanting penterythritol tetranitrate, or PETN, explosives directly into the casing. PETN is a secondary explosive, which means it's less sensitive than a blasting cap, but more sensitive than something like C4. I've seen wildly different reports about the amount of explosives used in the pagers. Some outlets said that up to a few ounces of explosives were planted, and it really just forced me to do one of the things I loathe most in this world: math. PETN has a relative density of about 1.77 grams per cubic centimeter. An ounce is 28 grams by itself. So a single ounce of PETN would occupy a total volume of, checks papers, 49.5 cubic centimeters. That's a smidge over 3 cubic inches in freedom units. The pagers aren't very big, with a total exterior volume of 98.5 cubic centimeters, so there's not a whole lot of room to work with. I believe that there were about 3 grams of explosives implanted in the pagers. This would only take up 5.3 cubic centimeters or 0.39 cubic inches. It would leave enough room for a miniaturized detonator, as well as any small modification to the circuit board or the pager itself. Considering the injuries reported were primarily to the face, hands, and abdomen, we can deduce that a small amount of explosives were used to cause fragmentation and contact blast injuries, but not enough for overpressure injuries such as lung or eardrum damage. These little booby traps weren't designed specifically to evict souls, they were made to send a message. Now, I've read some misinformation, or at the very least, theories that don't make a lot of sense to me as to how and where the explosives were planted. Some reports say that the PETN was injected into the batteries of the devices, which wouldn't work for a few reasons. PETN is not what is called a castable explosive, meaning it can't be melted into a liquid form and injected or poured into a container. Its explosive decomposition temperature is lower than its melting temperature, so you'd have to bind it to a plasticizer or other explosive in order to melt it. There are already semi-malleable explosives that use PETN as the base, like the flexible sheet version named DetaSheet, so I'm extremely reluctant to believe that that was the case. Another claim that I've seen is that the explosives were planted in the batteries themselves. It wouldn't be hard to notice a drop in battery life if any significant part of the battery was removed. And no, you can't get these types of injuries and deaths by forcing lithium-ion batteries to overheat and explode, and you certainly aren't going to try to place any meaningful amount of explosives into a battery and force the battery to overheat, in turn setting off the explosives that you painstakingly inserted into an unstable and volatile lithium-ion battery. To think about it another way, there are about 5,000 pagers that were booby-trapped in total. And this was done in a really short time frame, and I'm pretty sure the guys who were handling this whole operation were just happy to pack in some PETN in these things, assembly line style, and call it a day. You can even see a picture of one of the handheld radios after it blew up, and you can see the aluminum casing of the main radio is blown outward from the main circuit board. If it were in the battery, you would expect to see the same pattern formed inward. This doesn't change the outcome, but accuracy never hurts. Exploding pagers do. There's been a lot of speculation as to how these things were triggered to explode in the first place. The way I see it, both types of devices already had most, if not everything you would need to trigger a firing voltage. There's already power supplied, there's integrated chips that can process data from outside signals, they have oscillators in them that even allow the devices to count. A couple of bridged wires and maybe even a firmware update to these devices could have easily completed the job. CCTV videos and eyewitness reports show that the pagers began to either beep or vibrate long enough for the user to bring the pager out and read the message before detonating. All Israel had to do was systematically send out the firing signal to the pagers and radios, and you have a staggered wave of death popcorn going off across the country. I know I've made a couple of jokes throughout this whole thing, but at the end of the day, what really happened is not funny. Like, regardless of whatever your politics are, this is a serious situation, and it's evidence of a dystopian future in which you can't trust your own technology. I don't think that regular people are at risk of having their stuff tampered with, but what if the guy next to you on the bus is a terrorist beefing with a nation-state? Like, with over 3,000 total casualties, including 42 sudden cases of unaliving as of September 22nd, some of them were even children. I'm just really disappointed to hear that something like this was allowed to happen by a sitting government. Look, on that note, that's all for me for now. This being my first video, make sure to let me know in the comments below what you think, especially if you have any suggestions or questions you want me to run to ground. If you found this video interesting, consider subscribing, and I plan to discuss all things explosives from the news, everything that's happened in current events, from the past, and even in media and popular culture. So if you have any burning questions, or you need help settling a bet based on movies, TV, or videos you see on the internet, go ahead and put them in the comments section and I'll help you out. Until the next one, make good life choices, and don't go picking stuff up off the ground.